All right. So our first speaker for tonight will be Farmer Angus, and he will be followed by Mandla Nkomo, and lastly, Vanessa Black. All right. So firstly, about Kiss the Ground, I hope you thoroughly enjoyed the documentary based on the book by Joshua Tickle, Kiss the Ground, How the Food You Eat Can Reverse Climate Change, Heal Your Body, and Ultimately Save Our World, and narrative by Woody Harrelson. The film is quite optimistic. By using existing solutions, we can not just halt climate change, but also reverse some of its effects. I find that the science is explained in simple terms with lots of visually striking graphics and animation, and I think it has a potential to be a really powerful film. The only downside is, although the documentary visits some other countries like China and Zimbabwe, it is still primarily focused on the USA. But luckily tonight, we are fortunate enough to have three wonderful homegrown speakers who can contextualize the documentary for us on our South African soil. And just briefly, my key takeaways from the documentary was by regenerating the world's soil, we can help to stabilize our climate, restore lost ecosystems, and create abundant and healthy food supplies. Climate change has been exacerbated by industrial agriculture, the tillage, the chemical herbicides and pesticides, and monoculture. Regenerative agriculture, as the solution, can sequester carbon in the soil, which could be the key to reversing the effects of climate change or mitigating climate change. In the words of Woody Harrelson, save our soil in the hopes it might just save us. All right, without further ado, our first speaker will be Farmer Angus, and I'll just give you a brief introduction of Farmer Angus, or Angus McIntosh. He is one of two grass-fed, pasture-reared beef producers in the Western Cape. He uses biodynamic and regenerative agricultural principles in raising his farm's animals, which include cattle, pigs, and laying hens, and also in his vegetables and wine production. Farmer Angus achieved a world first in 2013 when he became the first person globally to sell carbon credits for increasing the carbon contents of the pastures where his cattle graze. Farmer Angus's passion for the earth, education, and the empowerment, for lack of a better word, of his employees is usually inspiring. I hope Farmer Angus will also tell us a bit about how he has made it possible for his employees to share in the ownership of his wonderful enterprise. All right, and so how it worked is we sent the speakers a whole bunch of questions relevant to the documentary and asked them to pick a few questions that they find most relevant and which they probably feel the most comfortable to speak about. So we've given them quite a bit of freedom. And while we listen to our speakers, you're welcome to type your questions in the question box, and then we will read it afterwards and discuss it. Thank you. Over to you.
Hi, Margot, and everybody else, although I'm looking at a blank screen at this stage. I would love to just have as many questions as possible. I can talk for hours and hours about what we do. It's so hard to try and get to the heart of the matter, but I think for me, the Kiss the Ground is an interesting thing to talk about, and maybe you only want to keep it to Kiss the Ground, but you asked specifically around how we bring things to the South African context. The South African context is that we are an extremely unhealthy society. The last global measure that I'm aware of that was done of health was that South Africa is the unhealthiest country in the world. It's a thing called the Indigo Global Wellness Index. You can look it up. And they ranked 191 countries in the world on 10 different health metrics, and we were ranked the unhealthiest country in the world. So my view is, what are environmental lawyers doing to reverse that? What are they doing to put in place laws and policing laws and putting people in jail who are making the climate an unhealthier place? And I'm talking about pollution in the food systems. I'm talking about polluting the atmosphere. Once you start looking into agriculture, and I mean, I've only been farming since late 2008, it's mostly a very poisonous exercise. People are at war with nature. They are doing things in violation of nature. And so therefore they have to keep you know, they have to use heinous chemicals to keep the system supported. And at the same time, agriculture has this gift whereby it can regenerate. And Kiss the Ground, I think, did a great job about that. They could probably go into a little bit more detail about how easy it is to reverse the damage. So I don't know if the law can be both a carrot and a stick. So, for example, if there are farms that are increasing the carbon content in the soil, that they end up paying less tax, that it becomes an incentive to do what is measurably good for the environment. We live on a carbon planet. We are carbon beings. Increasing carbon in the soil is a benefit to both water holding capacity, nutrient density. So the plants growing in the soil are healthier, the animals eating the plants are healthier, the humans eating the plants are healthier, and so it goes. Yeah, I mean, for me, the biggest environmental toxin is a thing called glyphosate. And I'd like to, if I can, and I'm not very skilled at matters IT, but I think I'm going to try and share my screen and try and pull up a slide. You disabled it. Okay, cool. That's fine. Margot, don't worry. You guys can do the research.
No problem. It's no problem at all. Melanie is the host and she can just enable you to share your screen. Then you can just press the button at the bottom that says share screen.
Should be available now.
Yeah, cool. Okay. So I'm hoping you can all see the screen. It's got a thing called glyphosate written on it. So I don't know how many people have heard of glyphosate before. It is by a long way the most widely used chemical. In fact, they've probably used more glyphosate than all other farm chemicals in the history of farm chemicals. It is used on lawns. Kirstenbosch uses it. 93% of all people in the world who've been tested for glyphosate in their urine have it in their urine. It is an extremely powerful poison. It is the active ingredient in a herbicide called Roundup. There are thousands of court cases in the US against Monsanto, which is now Bayer, against this specific chemical. South Africa has had a parliament since 1910, admittedly only a legitimate parliament from 1994, but the one law that went through parliament, the quickest of all laws in the history of the South African parliament, was the law allowing GMOs, which is allowing glyphosate to be used. We are the only country in the world where the staple diet is genetically modified to withstand this poison. This slide I'm referring to, Margot, just nod if you can all see the slide. It's got a correlation coefficients up. Okay, a lot of this work is pioneered by a professor at MIT called Stephanie Seneff, S-E-N-E-F-F. And what they do is they just take USDA data and CDC data in America. And the USDA data is the use of Roundup Ready crops, which is the use of glyphosate. I can explain why that is if there are any questions about it. And then the other data is from the CDC for the increase in all these diseases, mostly inflammatory diseases. And the correlation is amazing. So we're busy poisoning ourselves. Nobody who I know of in the legal fraternity talks about glyphosate. Nobody wants to, there's certainly no politicians that can even spell it, but it's a major, major problem. And it's in everything, wheat, corn, et cetera, et cetera. Just to give you an idea of how ubiquitous glyphosate is, I ended up practicing this form of agriculture because I read a book by Michael Pollan called The Omnivore's Dilemma. Let me just see if that book, you see that now, hey? It's The Omnivore's Dilemma. So the reason I'm farming is I read this book, and one of the things he does in this book is he takes the standard American meal and he puts it in what's called a mass spectrometer, so which analyzes that each individual ingredient down to the carbon atom to explain what the ingredients of it are. Because he wanted to understand how much corn is actually in the diet. So there are 5 parts of that meal, right? There's a burger, a chips, a Coke, a dressed salad, and an ice cream. So I don't know if if you guys, I don't know if I can see the chat thing here, but if you guys can just put which you think of those has the least corn in it. Just type it on the chat. So a burger, chips, Coke, dressed salad, and ice cream. I can't see the, wait, hold on, I can't actually see the, No, I can't see it from here. Margot, you're gonna have to read it to me. Are there any guesses?
No problem at all. I see a guess here of ice cream and salad, another ice cream and chips.
Okay. So of the 5, burger, chips, salad, Coke, ice cream, dressed salad. That's got the least corn in it. What's the percentage of corn in that? I need some more guesses.
I have a guess of 20% and 30% and 40%.
Okay, you're all lowballing. It's 52%. So just let that sink in for a moment. It means that of those 5 things that make up a standard American meal, the one that's got the least corn in is the chips, and that's 52%. And it's not even a whole corn, eh? It's a derivative of corn. They're all corn derivatives, and they're all filled with chemicals. And so you wonder why there's this increase in inflammatory diseases. No, Vandana Shiva is an amazing Indian physicist turned farmer who's worth following, says that the human race is committing species-wide suicide. And I have to completely agree with her. If you look at fertility rates globally, you look at cancer rates globally, the species is going extinct. And it's primarily through agriculture. So my challenge to the environmental lawyers is, what can you do to turn that around? You know, I'm not a lawyer, I can barely spell law, but I'm sure that there are some simple things that can be done to remedy the situation. And there's got to be a carrot and stick that one can use. You know, I mean, I believe in Durban, I grew up in KZN, but I believe that most people can't do their summer holidays in Mhlanga, because when the rioting happened in July, a big chemical plant got blown up and leaked all sorts of chemicals that are not even supposed to be in the country into the waterways. And so that the whole lake's gone sterile, and arsenic, I believe, is too much arsenic, things like that. You know, like, are those guys being pursued? You know, where's the environmental protection for that kind of stuff? I mean, there should just be merciless, the treatment of those guys for having chemicals in the country not allowed to have. Yeah, so the last thing I want to say before I open to questions is this next slide I brought up here. Okay, now admittedly, this was 23 years ago. This slide was brought up. I can tell you if you put if you continued the trend, it would be exactly this. It would be even more apples that you'd need to consume to get a tiny little bit of iron in. The nutritional quality of food has been in decline for more than 100 years because of the way people farm. Yeah, guys, I could go on and on and on. We can talk about the true environmental cost of the vegan diet, for example. Okay, ecologically, veganism is a total disaster. We can talk about the destruction of the rainforest. We don't have rainforest here, but we have a lot of forest that goes down. We can talk about the role of cattle and how they can revitalize things. Margot talked earlier about being paid carbon credits for the way we graze our cattle and increasing the carbon contents in the soil. So we can touch on that. Whatever. I'm going to think for me to see the comments, I think I need to unshare the screen. So I'm just going to do that.
All right.
So I can see the chat. So Margot, with your permission.
Yes, you're welcome to read the questions yourself if you'd like. Or would you like me to read them out?
No, I can see them. I just don't know which. Should I just try and answer?
Yeah, I'll read them out to you. No problem at all. We can start with the first one. Melanie asked, could we look at banning the use of the chemicals that you mentioned, glyphosate, for example, specifically?
But I think Vanessa's answered that, right?
Vanessa answered, there have been some attempts to ask the department to review the registration of glyphosate based on its reclassification as probably carcinogenic.
I think if I can just expand on the question, do we inherently need this chemical? Like, could we do away with it? Could farming practices still work without it? And if so, how?
Sure. That's a great question. Thank you. So it's a question, I mean, we do farm tours all the time. I don't know how many people on this call are based near Stellenbosch. but you're welcome to come on the next farm tour. For people who work during the week, we do once a month on a Sunday. And then we can get into some more detail. And we always get this question that the people love what we do. How are you going to feed the world? So in a previous life, I was a stockbroker. I used to work for Goldman Sachs. And in that time, I also knew, like everybody who comes to the farm, that the only way to feed the world, the 9 billion by 2050, is through this intensive form of agriculture. Highly damaging. It's the same story as economists like to tell you, that when a country is developing, it's going to pollute. And only once it's developed does it stop polluting. So of course, utter nonsense. So that's why China is allowed to pollute and India is allowed to pollute. But the ubiquity of this lie that the only way to feed the world is through this intense chemically damaging system is testament to the fact that the powers that be are making so much money out of it, they are not allowing any other form to be discussed. So on the margin, there are various people who are doing amazing work. For example, there's a thing called the Rodale Institute in Pennsylvania in the States. They, I think, are in year 45 or 44, 45 of a trial where they're running conventional systems and organic systems head to head on the same piece of land. It's called the Farming Systems Trial. You can go and research it. But it's on every measurable metric. Organic agriculture beats conventional agriculture. Whether it's what's going on in the soil, whether it's nutrition of the actual plants coming off it, whether it's water holding capacity, anything you want, it beats it. The issue is that it doesn't suit the existing economic model. And it also doesn't suit the existing economic diet. You know, ask mainstream doctors, mainstream dietitians, is sugar a problem? Well, no, no one even talks about it. You know, do we need corn in our diet? No. Do we need soya in our diet? No. Do we need palm oil? No. Do we need sugar? No. Well, guess what? If you took those 4 crops out, you wouldn't need to cut down the rainforest. So let me just finish back. The first thing is it's a very poisonous system, which not only produces terribly food that makes humans sick, it also pollutes the environment. Regenerative agriculture you stock more animals per hectare. You are sequestering carbon into the soil. You're creating employment. Margot talked earlier about staff. So I sold 85% of my egg business to my staff. I mean, that's not because I'm regenerative, but that was an empowering deal for them. It's been very interesting. These are all illiterate folk who now are having to learn how to read income statements. And every month when we go through the financials, they're doing a better job of understanding what's going on. And I don't think you can't divorce the financial from the social, from the ecological. Those 3 all need to work together. And, you know, it's interesting that you've got an environmental law association. Every lawyer in the country should be part of the environmental law association, should be part of everybody. I don't understand why there has to be a specialization and a separation in a way. The environment is what we live in. We all need to be aware of the environment. And I think the most important point I'd like to make is that every single person on this call is actually a farmer. Wendell Berry talks about it. He says we're all farmers by proxy. So every single person buys food. And when you buy food, you authorize a farmer to farm in the method that you deem appropriate, that they deem appropriate. Sorry, the farmer deems appropriate. So you can change through choosing the farmer that you support.
Thank you very much for bringing up that point, Angus, farmers by proxy, because I think generally it's quite easy to feel helpless, like the economies of scale, you know, determine the food that will be on the shelves, and we as consumers sometimes, often also with a tight budget, don't really have much power. But I guess maybe you can give us a pointer of things that we can be aware of, things that we can do.
Here's a very interesting thing. Our burgers are in Checkers. And in the new year, we'll be going to Pick and Pay with mince and bone broth. So our burgers are currently retailing at 149 Rand a kilo. Steer's burger is retailing at 166 Rand a kilo. Okay. If you wanna think about Steers, let me share the screen again and I'll show you what Steers is in one picture. There you go. Okay, so that photograph happens to be taken in the USA. We can drive within a 50K radius of where I'm sitting in Stellenbosch, and we can see exactly that story. And obviously, the biggest feedlots in this country are in Gauteng and in the Free State. The biggest one in the country, I think, has 152,000 cattle standing in the feedlot. Okay, I can talk you through details of how these animals are fattened and produced, because they come off grass and then they're weaned into a feedlot. But the meat coming from there, which has antibiotic resistance in for free, it's inflammatory disease for free because it's omega-6 overload, because the way the animal's digestive system has been violated. It has it's fattened on asthma drugs for the last 40 days of its life. That stuff is costing you per rand more than ours is costing you in a big national retailer. So regenerative food is not an elitist thing. It doesn't have to be more expensive. But the hidden costs in these other burgers are not in the price. So maybe what the Environmental Law Association can do is push the accountants to start talking about true cost accounting. What is the environmental cost of your decision, Mr. Banker? Because everything has an environmental cost. Everything.
Absolutely. And let's see if there's another question. Kate asked, it would be great to hear more about your regenerative farming methods. I don't think we have much time to go into that, but thank you very much for inviting everyone.
It's really simple. The regenerative stuff, the way we do it, we use livestock, and that's really important to understand the vegan point I was making earlier. We do what's called rotational grazing. So you put a lot of animals in a small space for a short period of time, and you give that land a long resting period. And you just pulse the land like that. And the most fertile soils in the world were the American prairie soils. These were created over time by these huge herds of herbivores that would migrate rotationally. And they have very deep, rich soils, which they're still mining today, in fact, with maize, which they plant. So that's what we do. We just rotate animals, long rest periods.
And that's very interesting also to understand, because I think some documentaries have villainized the cow. We do need cows to keep our soil healthy, keep the earth healthy. So, and I do think some documentaries have villainized them a bit. And part of the work is probably taking that around.
Listen, the great thing about the vegan movement is that it has led to documentaries like this and conscientize people to how their food is produced. No, the tragedy of the movement is twofold. The first tragedy is that it's been hijacked by big food, who now are ramming the plant-based thing down everyone's throats, which is just pet food in another guise. And then the second thing is that their solution, then the vegan solution, is an environmentally deleterious solution. And this is what I mean by it. All beings that grow need food. We need food, plants need food. So in the organic regenerative world, you use animal manures to create composts and fertilizers which grow the plants. In the vegan utopia without animals, you will use what conventional agriculture uses anyway, which is what's called NPK fertilizers. Okay, so these fertilizers are immensely damaging to the environment. Cornell University in the States did a study a few years ago, 2018, I think it was, where they traveled around America looking at the methane emissions of fertilizer plants. Now, methane, if we think CO2 is a bad thing, methane is that on steroids. Depending on who you listen to, they'll say it's 24 or 100 times more damaging than CO2, or global warming potential than CO2. The US fertilizer industry emits 3 times more methane than all other industries in the USA combined. Just think about that for a moment. People are saying, oh, it's methane from cow farts. It's absolute rubbish. It's the US fertilizer industry, 3 times more methane than all other industries combined. So it's completely dishonest to blame cattle. Of course, there's no place for feedlots. There's no place for cage animal agriculture. But cattle managed properly are a solution to building carbon in the soil, which is where we want carbon. We don't want it in the atmosphere. And for me, that's the the 2 big failures of the vegan movement are those 2 things.
Great, thank you very, very much, Angus. We might ask some more questions if we have time afterwards, but thank you very much for your insights. And so next up, we'll move on to Mandla Nkomo. Welcome, Mandla, and thank you for joining us today. So I'll tell you a little bit about Mandla. Mandla is an agribusiness development expert with over 2 decades experience in Southern Africa and 15 years in South Africa. He currently serves as the Chief Growth Officer for CGIAR, which is the consultative group on international agricultural research. That's a very big innovation network. And their Excellence in Agronomy initiative, which is Mandla's current portfolio, is directed towards sustainable intensification of smallholder farming systems in the global south. Mandla is passionate about agricultural development and unlocking the power of science and digital to improve and transform rural livelihoods. So I also sent Mandla a whole bunch of questions and asked him to select some, but I'm particularly excited to get his perspective from his many years of working with small-scale farmers, because that's also smallholder farmers, because that's also an element in the argument of regenerative agriculture that I would like us to discuss. All right, over to you. Thank you very much, Mandla.
Thank you so much, Margot, and really good to be here. I just want to put up my slides, if I may. Don't know why I'm seeing the whiteboard. Okay, let me stop sharing. I think something didn't go well there. Let me try again. Okay. Then share. Okay, hopefully you guys can see this. Okay, yeah, listening to Angus, I was very inspired to hear his thoughts, and apologies for joining a bit late. I had a meeting that ran up until half an hour ago and another one that's starting as soon as I'm done. But I'm really pleased at the opportunity to chat to yourselves as the Environmental Law Association, and really, inspired at the interest that you are showing in having conversations that, in my view, are actually, going right to our very existence as human beings, and particularly as South Africans and Southern Africans in general. The truth of the matter is that we have 2 realities. And the reality on small farms is that if you're looking at crops or even animal production, it's characterized by poor yields. I've worked in almost every country in Southern Africa. I'm currently joining this call from East Africa in Kenya, Nairobi. I've worked in this part of the world as well, in Uganda. That story repeats itself over and over again. There's also issues associated with the quality of the produce. If you're looking at the beef side, you find that sometimes our smaller farmers market their beef a little bit too late, and as a result, the eating quality of the meat is not so great. And like Angus said, there is ways in which that could be done properly in a sustainable manner. And generally, I think it would be fair to say that there's an element of poor productivity and very limited profitability for the farmers. And I think when climate change, the reality of climate change continues to stare at us in the face, it's very clear that the most vulnerable people perhaps are not so much the large farmers, but the small farmers who are finding the lands and the pastures that they are using are becoming less and less productive. And if you are a cattle farmer like myself, you're finding that your pastures are perhaps struggling to sustain the numbers of animals that you want to keep. So we've got a challenge. And in the organization that I work for now, we've got another reality. And the reality is that there's been a lot of scientific research into a lot of the things that Angus spoke about. There's been a lot of research in improved crop varieties, and this is not even GMO. It's just, selecting good varieties through normal hybrid technology. There's even, improved evidence-based, agronomy approaches, whether it's on ecological systems of agriculture or conventional agriculture. Technology now allows us to provide advice to farmers based on where they are located and not just giving, blanket advisories. We are now able to predict with a measure of confidence, the weather patterns in specific areas and what, when people should plant and what the potential biomass or carrying potential of certain rangelands is. So all this stuff is there. So it then doesn't make sense that the reality on the left continues to exist, where from a science perspective, there is enough tools in our arsenal for us to be able to respond to this. And I think the honest truth is that the science has not delivered on the potential. It has not delivered, and we are in a position where we are now in trouble because climate change is upon us, and we need a radical approach, which in our view combines sustainable intensification and climate change adaptation. We cannot do it without healthy soils. So we need to focus on improving the health of our soils. And I'll explain later why that is important. We need to really work on climate adaptation and increasing the ability of farmers to respond to climate change. There needs to be resource use efficiency, whether it's water or soil nutrients, or even the labor that people spend on their farms. And ultimately, farmers must make a living from the land. And I was glad to see Angus pointing out that his, burgers are costing a little bit less than what we are getting from our colleagues at SPARE. But the next question is, so where are we doing this? And this is just an example of where some of the work that we're doing is, and you'll notice that there's the reappearance of the word fertilizer quite a few times there. And we are using fertilizer in the widest sense of the word there, and about how to use crop nutrients in a sustainable manner. But the question then is, after watching Kiss the Ground, why on earth should we care? Why should we even be having this conversation? I think I've already said that, well, this is an existential challenge. It's an existential challenge for humanity. It's an existential challenge for Southern Africa. I grew up in a part of the world where the moniker son of the soil was given a very high prominence. It meant that you were really like a higher form of individual because there's an acceptance in most cultures in this part of the world that we derive from the soil, and therefore the soil needs to be looked after. And if you are called a son of the soil, that's the highest honor any man can give to you. And therefore it is important to save our soils. And I think it was quite surprising for me about a decade ago to see one of the biggest monocropping operations in South Africa make a 360-degree transition from purely mineral fertilizer-based agriculture to what they call nature farming, and that's ZZ2. And if you read on their website what they say about why they had to do that, it's exactly the things that Angus spoke about. Now, what we need to realize is that as agriculture dies, as industrial agriculture dies at the fringes, it is the small towns and the rural areas that are becoming ghost towns. I've seen it myself. If you take a drive from Gauteng through the Eastern Cape, all the way down to the coast, your heart will break at what's happening to our dorpies and how those marginal farming areas are dying. And they're dying because of years and years of this conventional type of agriculture that has not been helpful for people. But the honest truth, Margot, is that I was excited to talk about this topic because it's very personal to me. It's personal because I have experienced at a personal level what it means to lose everything as a result of what conventional agriculture has done to the soils. In 2015, I established a company which was able to acquire on a long-term rental, 150-hectare fully irrigated vegetable farm in the south of Johannesburg. In terms of assets and endowments, we had pack houses, we had customers, we were the top supplier in 2 main crops. And so everything was fine, or at least I thought. I was able to mobilize sufficient investment to put into this business. And in very short time, we're able to increase employment, and we started to grow the sales of this business quite substantially. But what we didn't know was that the soil was almost irrecoverably dead on that farm. We found out when we lost an 8 million rand crop of spring onions to white rot, which is caused by a fungus which had become so much a part of that soil because of monocropping that it had basically rendered that soil unusable. Because of climate change, we had severe frost that year, and we had to write off over 6 million rands worth of a cabbage crop because the weather was too cold and all the cabbages bolted as soon as the heat units changed. In desperation, we started doing what we call postage stamp farming, where I allowed an old German gentleman to come onto the farm and farm strips of land with this crazy thing he was talking about, which he was calling regenerative agriculture. I kid you not, in less than 3 months, he was producing produce on lands that I had given up on. But it was being done on a postage stamp size. At that time, I was running out of runway. It was not going to be fast enough for me to reverse the losses that we had made. And unfortunately, in 2017, the business had to be shut down, and I was left with debt, which I'm still paying up to today. And I had to lay off 325 small workers who up to now, some of them still don't have work. So this issue that is addressed in the film Kiss the Ground is personal to me because I know what it's like to lose everything because you have already lost the soil. And therefore, this is not something that we talk about because we are privileged middle-class people who have got nothing better to do with our time. This is an existential challenge, and that requires change. If you look at the numbers in South Africa around what's happening in agriculture. Everyone talks about the concentration where we've lost from over 100,000 farmers to probably between 20 and 30,000 who are farming commercially. And the reason for that is not just about cost factors and other things. The reason for that is that because of the type of agriculture that was practiced and incentivized in the past, a lot of those farms have become unviable. And people have had to leave their farming operations in those areas. But I think the biggest tragedy, and this is the point, the main point I want to make this afternoon, is that from the Land Act, we have basically disconnected the bulk of this country's population from the land, and therefore the majority of the population do not feel any burden, do not feel any responsibility to ensure that we've got living soils in South Africa that are able to sustain us. Because to them, Pick n Pay and ShopRite will provide the food that they need as soon as the social grant is paid. We need to reconnect every single citizen of this country to the soil and give them the understanding that they have a personal responsibility to keeping it alive. If they're not keeping it alive, they're contributing to its death. So what is the solution as I conclude, Maho? I believe that all people who are on the land count. And if it is true that all people on the land count, therefore every farmer, every consumer should be an agent for either soil health or soil death through the choices that we make and the activities that we do. It's a dichotomous choice. There is nothing in the middle. It's either we're contributing to soil health or we're contributing to soil death. We need to end what I'm calling the estrangement that the majority of South Africans, and to a certain extent Southern Africans, have with the land. Everyone must be responsible. If you drive through the former homeland areas, the potential that is there for restorative agricultural practices is not even being realized because people stopped farming decades ago. And as a result, for them, they do not see the value that they can bring to this conversation that we're having today. If we're not able to turn regenerative agriculture and agricultural practices into a mass participation sport, we run the risk of having isolated pockets of success in a field of disaster and desperation. So what can we do? We need to make it possible and easy for all farmers, regardless of size, to know the state of their soils. But here is where it breaks down. If you needed to get a soil test done today, you need to have a courier, you need to send it to a laboratory, you need to wait for a couple of weeks to get an answer back, and then you need to find someone to interpret the results, and only then can you know what to do. And that will set you back no less than 5,000-6,000 Rand. It cannot be that we are making it an elite activity to know the state of the soil. In my previous job at Solidaridad, we worked hard at cracking that nut by providing soil health services to small-scale farmers at less than $10 US, giving them advisory and an indication of the state of their soil where they were. We could go into their lands with handheld scanners and give them the information. So we need to make it easy for all farmers to access knowledge, practices, and tools that support soil health restoration. We need to unlock the power of digital technologies to provide information faster, to know people, and in contextually relevant manners. To give you an example, there is now an Africa-wide digital soil map, which on the basis of just a GPS coordinate you can at least understand the amount of organic carbon on your soil, the amount of phosphate, the amount of nitrogen, etc. And you can at least have some understanding of the state of your soil without having a soil test done. It's called the ISDA soil map, and I really recommend everyone to look at that. The last point I want to make is that this transition that we're talking about, which I think Angus has also spoken about, it's not going to be free. We need mechanisms to fund it. There is money flowing in and out of carbon markets across the world. How do we make sure that that money actually flows to the farmers and the land users who can make a difference to this question that we're talking about? I think before I close, I think we need to also be honest and say, unfortunately, there is a political economy associated with food and even regenerative agriculture. And that political economy means that things are never what they look like, and things are not always called what they are. And therefore, I think yourselves in your privileged position as the Environmental Law Association really have an opportunity, I think, to manage the discourse in South Africa about how we democratize soil health management, make it something everyone participates in, and ensure that we are all agents of soil health and soil death. Because if we do not do that, we're going to continue to have islands of progress when what we actually need are seas of change. Thank you so much, Margot.
Thank you very, very much for that, Mandla. And thank you so much also for sharing your very personal story. That was really a wonderful surprise, and it's always better when we get firsthand sharing of experience. Thank you very much for that. I'll just read out a couple of questions that I have here. You mentioned that harmful practices, farming practices, are currently incentivized in South Africa. How are they incentivized? And related to that question, what does the current South African policy do in terms of supporting farmers who want to change that, who want to farm regeneratively, or who have already made the transition and need support?
I think that's a good question. So the incentivization of harmful farming practices is not a present problem only. This starts from even before democracy. If you look at the way agriculture was organized before through the different marketing boards and the cooperations associated with them, it was a very regimental system where if you want to grow maize in the Free State, whether you use Senvest or you use someone else, the package is simple. You are going to be able to access the fertilizer from them on credit. They will access the seed for them on credit. They're not going to give you access to soil correction mechanisms like composting and so forth. It's not on the list of things that will be funded by a cooperation. So what does the farmer do? The farmer goes to where it is easy to get the inputs that he needs to put food on the table, because ultimately most farmers have to take a short-term view about doing what is best for now, not so much for the next generation. And the more they are squeezed into limited options, and those options, like I think Angus kind of intimated, are focused on a particular type of agriculture which is unsustainable. That's the agriculture that you will see in the economy. And that's where we are right now. That the financing system for agriculture, even the subsidies that come for government, they will put out a tender for, not for let's go and restore the soils in Matatiele, or let's go and restore the soils in Jozini, in Umkhanyakude, but they'll be saying, okay, we want so many tons of fertilizer, so many hectares of land plowed, And so they are basically reaffirming a system that is getting us into trouble, and there is no money being spent on restorative and regenerative agriculture. And I'll challenge anyone to show me where it is being done. I know entities like SunBio and others are doing, stuff around invasive vegetation and so forth. But all of us on this call know that that is window dressing. It's too little. The problem is bigger than what we are taking to the problem.
Yes, thank you very much, Mandla. So that seems to be the problem in many parts of the world, that farmers get trapped into a system where, as we have seen as well in India, for example, the smallholder farmers that get supplied with the big Monsanto GMOs and fertilizers, herbicides, pesticides. Thank you very much for explaining that to us and for helping us to understand better that maybe if more farmers, if the vast majority of farmers demanded that they want to change, that they want a different system, that potentially that could happen. Vanessa asked that, please can you share the link to the soil map, but I can also get that from you afterwards and we can share it. Thank you very much.
Absolutely.
And Melanie said, such powerful stuff, Mandla for president. And I would like to echo that.
What I can say is the last Nkomo who tried to be president ended up as vice president. So I don't know if my chances are that good.
Oh, that's already very, very high up. I think you have good chances. And then we also have a question here. What is one of the concrete actions that the Environmental Law Association could take, perhaps related to the last question you answered?
I think this is really where it gets exciting. If most of you on this call are lawyers, maybe except Angus and myself, and you of all people understand how policy is formulated in this country. A good example is if you look at environmental law, this country has done fantastic work about preservation of wetlands, for example. And that was as a result of not only advocacy, but also creating the legal and legislative framework that allows for the protection of wetlands to happen. I'm in Kenya right now. Nairobi is a city of wetlands, but there is no attempt whatsoever to protect wetlands. Why? Because there are no consequences for doing the contrary. So first of all, I think what you as the Law Association can do is to advocate for a situation where we need reporting of, for example, what is the state of our soils in the different parts. It needs to be part of almost like how Stats SA does it, where they have a labor survey, they've got a household survey and so forth. We need maybe a legislated soil health survey that puts it in everyone's face, the actual baseline state of our soils. I know the ARC has been doing a lot of this work, especially their soil institute, but because the ARC is so underfunded, they are doing piecemeal stuff. The scientists, they spend more time looking for money than actually doing science. So it's an advocacy thing. It's about creating the right kind of legislative frameworks that first of all, create the opportunity to provide the information, and then creates an incentives and disincentive environment that will then allow financiers, like Standard Bank, like all the commercial banks, who, by the way, fund almost 70% of commercial agriculture, to start embedding into their funding systems requirements for certain practices to be part of their work. Woolworths, you will not be a Woolworths supplier if you are not signed up to their farming for the future system. I know that over time that has even become very watered down, but for crying out loud, at least they tried, right? At a global level, big fund managers like BlackRock and so forth now will not fund anyone who's funding coal, right? That's from advocacy. And what would that look like in a South African setup to say, how do we finance this transition? Because like I said, it's not going to come cheap. It's going to require radical change from where people are now to where people need to be. It needs to be funded. And my sense is that you as the Environmental Law Association have a role to play in basically creating the advocacy platforms, contributing to legislative frameworks that create incentives and disincentives for deviant behavior and approach.
Thank you very much, Mandla. That was a very clear answer. And Melanie answered to that. Melanie's also with the Environmental Law Association. She said we will look at progressing a project on soil health advocacy next year, perhaps.
Mandla to that.
All right, wonderful. Thank you so much, Mandla. I think we'll move on now to our next speaker. I know you almost have to leave, so I'll just say bye for you for now, but really thank you so much for joining us and for sharing your wonderful insights.
Thanks for the opportunity, and really thank you as the ELA for having the soundness of mind of putting on the agenda this important topic. Really kudos to you and everyone else on the team. Thank you so much.
Thank you. All right, we'll move on to our next, our final speaker, Vanessa Black. I'll give you a brief overview of Vanessa. So Vanessa's rich career started as the Gauteng coordinator of the Environmental Justice Networking Forum. She has worked with various initiatives, including EarthLife Africa, the African Center for Biodiversity, the Institute for Zero Waste in Africa, the Agricultural Management Unit of the eThekwini Local Government, and the South Durban Community Environmental Alliance. In 2015, she began contributing to the information materials for Biowatch SA, and she formally joined them in 2017 as their Advocacy, Research and Policy Coordinator. And that's the role she currently fulfills there. All right, thank you. And I see you've already shared your screen. Thank you very much. We look forward to learning from you.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me fine? Okay. All right, thank you very much. And thanks for the very interesting speakers. I'm sorry Mandla had to go. It was really an engaging presentation. Also I've been asked various questions. So I just thought I'd put this out there. So you probably know our little organization. I'm from a very small NGO based in KZN, got 2 offices, one in Biowatch, one in Durban and one in Matuba. And you probably as lawyers have heard about us for the Biowatch principle when our little organization tried to get information on GMOs from government, and Monsanto came into the court case and we lost the first round and had costs awarded against us, even though, we won the case. We work in, mostly in KZN. We started as an environmental justice organization around the issue of biodiversity and biodiversity conservation in relation to biotechnology and biopiracy, and then have moved on in a way to working on agroecology and food sovereignty to try and balance and show that agroecology and different ways of producing can work. And it's not just that we have to have industrial agriculture to feed people. And that narrative that Angus spoke about earlier about that's the only way. Otherwise, we won't be able to feed the growing population is one that we really challenge. And so social justice is key in the work that we do. And we try and link the evidence on the ground to our policy work. So I just wanted to put this in because I think this is some of the context that we're working within and the challenging issues that we need to deal with in terms of our policy on agriculture. And the picture on the left is a photo from one of the communities we work in, where people have been removed from the plains that you see in the distance onto these very inhospitable hillsides with terrible soil, no water, no piped water. They rely on rainwater, but they look down on this lime green irrigated sugarcane and other agricultural plantations that they don't have access to even drinking water. They also are challenged with new mining operations that destroy the land and the underground water and the various plantations, so timber plantations, sugar, etc. in the area. And it's just this dichotomy in the history that Mandla was talking about that brings us to a place where 2.5 million smallholder farmers are battling it out in these contexts, while a very small commercial agriculture sector is producing with an industrial agriculture system and have access to the markets, etc., while smallholders are marginalized. And we particularly focus our advocacy against industrial agriculture or the industrialized food system more particularly, because it's at the center of a number of problems. So the IPCC finally started looking into agriculture and the food system seriously in terms of climate change. And the 2019 report said that the industrial food system contributes as much as 37% of climate change emissions. Yet we do very little to deal with the way that we produce food and the agricultural system and the food system as a whole. It's also highly toxic, as Mandla and Angus have mentioned. It's very bad for our health and nutrition in South Africa. So, for example, even though we've got this industrial food system that produces food, and we produce very well per capita if you measure the total production, we supply 120% of our dietary energy needs in the country. But we all know that we have outrageous hunger and malnutrition in the country, with growing diseases like diabetes. Obesity is a major problem, and yet also roughly a quarter of South Africans are extremely food insecure, and the numbers have gone up during COVID. We're also losing our biodiversity, and in particular our agricultural diversity, which we often don't think about as a subset of biodiversity. I've mentioned access to land as being an issue, and the other part of it is access to water. So often we talk about land rights and land restitution, but even if communities get access to land, they often don't have access to the water that they need, because the water rights are given over to those big industrial developments like mining and plantations, etc. And then the other common resource that we're losing rapidly is seed, and I'll talk more about that. And this whole industrial food system is driven by corporates and corporate interests that advertise to us about what we should buy. They process and make foods available, and that is the only food available in the supermarket. They determine prices, they determine what you can grow, so more and more sort of controlling the whole value chain from the farm all the way to your fork, and determining the prices so that producers are more and more, even in the formal sector, having to produce for lower prices while their input costs are going up. So a very terrible situation all round for the producers and the people who need food. So we promote agroecology as a counter to the industrialized food system. And agroecology has become a movement that's grown over a number of years. It first started as an approach based on ecological science looking at agronomy. But over the years, it's grown as a response to the situation in the world around food systems and the corporate agenda driving food system change and controlling our food more and more. And in 1996, social movements, indigenous peoples movements came together and contested what was happening at the World Food Summit, and then set up a separate international planning committee for food sovereignty that promotes agroecology and food sovereignty. And then there's two very important documents, the Declaration of Nyaleni on Food Sovereignty that was drawn up in 2007, and then a follow-up one in 2015 on agroecology as a key element in the construction of food sovereignty. And I want to just share some quotes from it. So they're very detailed documents. But food sovereignty is basically saying that it's not just food security. Food security is not enough. Technically, South Africa is food secure at national level, but that doesn't mean that everyone has access to food. That also doesn't mean that you get healthy food or culturally appropriate food, or that is produced in an ecologically sound way. And so food sovereignty is trying to turn that on the head and say that's what we want, and we want the right to be able to determine that for ourselves and have control over our agricultural systems. And so agroecology is then seen as it's diverse and has different aspects. So the one is learning from nature. It's a way of life and the language of nature. So it's trying to see what's happening in different ecologies in different places and learn principles from what we see and can learn from nature. And therefore, it's not like one set of like rote technologies that you can apply in the same way everywhere. It's different ways of doing things that are appropriate to place. So it's practiced in many different ways, but always respecting Mother Earth and based on principles and values, common shared values. It's also political, and this is a very important aspect that I think in some ways differentiates agroecology from regenerative agriculture, although the regeneration movement is also changing and taking on new things. But agroecology, in terms of the social movements perspective, is definitely political because it requires us to challenge and transform these structures of power and to put the control of seed, biodiversity, land, territory, water, knowledge, culture, and the commons in the hands of the people who feed the world. And that's what we're losing a grip on more and more as corporations become more powerful in the food system and also in setting policy agendas. So as we saw with the recent UN Food Systems Summit, which diverted the policy space from the Committee on World Food Security, which is a multi-stakeholder space where everyone, including civil society and industry, have their own organizing space and voice, to this UN Food Systems Summit, which is all about multilateral public-private partnerships and with very little ability to hold anyone to account. So in sort of a summary about what agroecology is, it's this practice that learns from nature. It's also a science because it's based on ecological science. And so it adds ecological science to, for example, traditional knowledge and knowledge in communities to design sustainable agroecosystems. And it's also become this movement of producers and consumers, workers, etc., that are all taking on a political agenda to transform the food system. And through advocacy and lobbying from all these civil society movements, there has been some impact on international policy so that agroecology was recognized by the Food and Agricultural Organization. There's agroecology department, and it's finally got brought into the food systems policy space under the CFS with this a scientific report and policy guidance. Unfortunately, through lobbying, other innovative approaches were also slipped in, and so it's slightly diluted from what was intended. But nevertheless, the scientific document very clearly describes agroecology and agroecological principles and its importance for food system change. And there's also FAO 10 elements, and I've put this in because agroecology has science principles, but it also has other principles related to food system change, like creating circular and solidarity economies, building in resilience, incorporating culture and food traditions, looking for synergies and efficiency, recycling resources, etc. And very importantly, the co-creation and sharing of knowledge. So going back to producers and really understanding from producers what they would need, and producer to producer sharing and science. And if you compare that with the principles for regenerative agriculture, I think the regenerative movement started very much looking at the soil health, and that's one of the key principles of agroecology. So we kind of see regenerative agriculture as one of the ways of putting things into practice that fit within agroecology, but it doesn't take on, or hasn't up till now, that political side. And I just put in there, and no synthetic chemicals, question mark, because what I liked about the documentary was that it was very clear that it doesn't include synthetic chemicals, but that sometimes gets a bit confused depending on who's speaking about regenerative agriculture. So very quickly to share some of the things that we do as Biowatch, we particularly focus on smallholder farmers, especially women farmers who are the most marginalized, often in terms of their communities and in deep rural areas, but also generally in South Africa. And they get very little support from mainstream agriculture. So also the extension service that's supposed to help them is so entrenched and educated within the commercial industrial system that they almost deride local farmers and deride their knowledge. They've said things like, throw away your go-go seeds, they're useless. They don't value the traditional knowledge these women have, which is very deep and very nuanced, and they really are scientists in their own right. So the aspects that we look at is soil regeneration. It's working with polycultures of mixed crops, ensuring and having ground covers and grains and diverse crops that build the soil, but are also feed for animals and food. We incorporate indigenous plants that repel insects. We don't kill pests. It's more trying to get a balance in the system. And natural areas are very important also as sources of food, as well as biodiversity. So the first intervention is around household vegetable gardens, making sure that people are food secure at the household level. And there's various techniques for soil improvement and catching water in these extremely water scarce environments. In the field, it's diverse intercropped rain-fed fields, so no irrigation. And the way that's accomplished is also by swales, things to catch water, and then diverse intercropping and using the legumes to cover the ground. Also looking at the traditional three sisters of the grains, the beans and the cocoa bits that cover while the beans climb up the grains. And this is looking at how the farmers get their soil more fertile, especially this picture on the left was in a very, very dry year where there was just nothing. It was dead, and animals were breaking through fences to try and nibble whatever green matter they could see. So it's using planting basins and that catch the water and then concentrating whatever manure and materials you can, and then that's the result is this very diverse field, depending on how you plant, and it's very tightly intercropped. And then one community we work with also has a market garden that sells into town, and they've managed to get a contract with Pick and Pay, but that's also been it's not what we think should be the ideal, because it's sort of, they're very much dictated to about what they should grow, and then they end up trying to match the markets, which is very monoculture oriented in terms of, it's just conventional crops of spinach or cabbage, etc., and it counteracts the polyculture that the farmers have. Underpinning all this work is also developing seed. So each farmer has a household seed bank, and we've worked very hard with them to revive and build their seed diversity. So that's looking at more appropriate legumes that are resilient in the drought conditions or in variable climate, traditional watermelons, traditional grains like millets, pearl millet, sorghum, that have been abandoned also because of the push from the commercial sector dictating what kinds of food we should be growing and what commodities. And the process to do that is to sit with the community and try and remember, this is on the left, biodiversity wheel, exploring with them what traditional or indigenous crops and seed they had, for example, and what's little, what's much, and what's been lost and needs reviving. We also need to, once communities start reviving their seed, there's also sharing between them on how to process some of the crops, because things like millets, people have this, very elders that have the knowledge, and they're losing the knowledge on how to process the crops, how to cook, how to, especially storage and all those things. So it needs a process of revitalizing that. And then also advocacy. So we did a lot together with many other organizations in the country, trying to stop the imposition of plant breeders' rights law, which is coming from the international space and pushed by corporate breeding to push out indigenous and traditional seed and basically say that the only things that can be grown need to be registered, and they need to be uniform and stable and conform to this industrial model. So unfortunately, that's one of the areas where the law went through, but there's still regulations that need to be negotiated, that we can try and put some protections on around farmer seed and try and not have them completely pushed out of the system as is being tried. And that resistance goes all the way up across Africa, where we have the AU now trying to push seed harmonization laws that also come from the corporate lobbying, that is trying to make rules and regulations and say that farmers can't save seed. They have to have the commercial ones. And then there's things around also GMOs, the fact that government gives out GMOs to smallholders, people aren't informed. So the whole extension system is looking at those input supplies that are industrial, and there's also contamination of the traditional varieties that farmers are trying to keep by those hybrids or GM seed. A very important part of the whole thing is also trying to change consumer taste, because people have been eating these processed foods, and particularly maize, for so long that people have often lost the taste for some of the traditional foods. So it's also a part of reviving the culture in that way, sharing how to cook, and particularly engaging youth on foods, cultural foods, that they now have lost the taste for, because they'd rather go for the commercial burgers and fried chicken, etc. And we're part of an initiative called the Seed and Knowledge Initiative, which works in 4 countries with other partners similarly to us, looking at how to spread agroecology and revive seed, and also push back on corporate seed capture. And this, I'm sorry that Mandla's not here, because one of the things that we found, we've gone through this period of both the COVID lockdown. We've also gone through the looting, where people have been cut off from supermarkets. And we'd, before that, in the extreme drought, done some research on food baskets in the communities we work in, just a small research piece, looking at agroecological food baskets versus the food baskets in households growing conventionally. And what we found in all of that is that the agroecological farmers are more food secure, that they've been able to eat, but also share and sell surplus in their communities, also to neighbors that are struggling, and that they have more diverse diets and therefore more nutrition, and they've also been saving money. And I've put a link just to the report on the agroecological food basket research, and hopefully we'll have some more on the experience of COVID next year. And so to end off, just what can we learn from COVID? And I think there's a lot that environmental lawyers can do in food system work. So it's just helping our policy be grounded in a rights-based approach throughout. And there's many ways that plays out. I've shared a bit on the seed and the right to seed and saving seed, but there's many others. Issues around the equitable access to our commons, whether it's freshwater, sea, land, seed, etc. How we use land and sea. I think there's a big debate to be had in the land restitution debate around what viable land sizes are to have productivity that's in tune with our planet and each other. And we can look to countries like Cuba also for some indicators on policy. Yeah, how we prioritize the use of water. So, you know, we continue to promote mining and these sugar plantations. In the height of the drought in 2016, the KZN government spent more money on providing timber saplings and fertilizer to small growers than they did on drilling boreholes to rescue communities from the drought. So just that prioritization is a big issue, I think, of where we invest. And the right to nutrition for all, how we value and build on traditional knowledge with appropriate science and technology supporting it instead of a top-down approach. And yeah, connected to that very much, you know, what is the appropriate level of technology? When we talk about technology or even digitalization, are we alienating people rather than including them? And how we can localize food systems and what are the policies that prevent that from happening and becoming viable. So all those little regulations around food health that are meant for exports to other markets, and then we impose them on smallholders and they can't trade, or yeah, just we get caught up in a lot of regulation. So it's not saying that food should be unsafe, etc., but there's appropriate ways that people could provide fresh food at local level, and how can we lobby for those local markets? And then also, yeah, including conservation use of wild commons, so how that connects with people rather than alienates them. And then in the meantime, also how while we're trying to transition, we curb the power of corporations. And I think for us, we very strongly advocate that you can't have parallel systems, because the industrial one is constantly contaminating your other approach, or, you know, curbing it in some way. And that's been also a problem with policy. There was an attempt at an agroecology strategy at one point, but the approach was it's sort of like a niche production method rather than understanding that's a different way of organizing the food system as a whole. And so, yeah, while we're transitioning to an alternative that's people and planet friendly, how can we look at equitable use of the commons? How can we do agrochemical policy reform, for example, banning highly hazardous pesticides that are, you know, banned elsewhere but imported here? And I mentioned that working group, Unpoison, that's part of our platform that you're welcome to join. Protecting vulnerable workers and how we handle a food systems transition, and then also being really on guard about the corporate agendas that keep influencing our policy. So there's these pushes for public-private partnerships, technology fixes without really looking at the impact. A big emphasis on individual behavior instead of system change. And then things like climate smart agriculture. There's a whole lot of ways that language has been appropriated, but they're actually just new ways to get subsidies for giving fertilizer, biotechnology, hybrid seeds, etc., to people, and covering up the impact. So if you'd like more information, we've got a whole lot of publications on our website, and also our Good Food Conversations with lots of interesting conversations about food and a different way of doing food. And I thought I'd end with this, just that I'm pity Mandla's not here. This is a sketch I did a long time ago about how nurturing our topsoil is a fundamental act of creativity.
Thank you very, very much, Vanessa. I wish we had more time for questions. I have so many questions. At your second last slide, you briefly touched on policy. You confirmed Mandla's point how the value chain determines which crops and, you know, the industrial production model. And then you briefly touched on policy. So I would like to refer to Adie's question: what is the stance of the National Department of Agriculture on regenerative agriculture? She actually asked that during Mandla's presentation, but I think you were mentioning a policy that they attempted. Can you just elaborate on that?
Yeah, and it's died a horrible death, yeah, for various reasons. But in general, despite some nice indications that have come out lately around needing to support traditional knowledge, etc., on the whole, the department supports the industrial model, and it's been a big bone of contention. We've had a lot of advocacy on it. So from the overall policy, the climate change response, for example, is just climate smart agriculture, and that's the way it's implemented. Is it's basically saying you still use agrochemicals, you just you know, you target your fertilizer, you use more technology to assess the soil conditions, and then you target it, but you don't give up it. Or you do conservation agriculture using Roundup to get rid of the weeds, and then you plant your things, and then you don't disturb the soil. So that's what I was saying. We have to be aware of those corporate lobbies and how they co-opt our terminology increasingly, and look at what's going on behind the scenes. Also, in terms of smallholder support, the extension officers are 100% like, you know, do commercial. If you're wanting to do something else, we can't help you. That's, you know, like one response that we've had. Or they like derogatory, as I said, and put people down and dismiss with their knowledge. The agricultural learning institutions also come from that framework, and we tried to have a project with one of them, and there was a lot of resistance in the college to sort of saying, oh no, your approach can't work. It's all very well for like small scale agriculture, subsistence agriculture, but it can't be scaled. And there's many examples now worldwide where regenerative and agroecological approaches are being scaled in various forms. Yeah, so there's not a supportive environment. And in fact, the most recent policy on producer support has had a whole turnaround from saying that we need to support, you know, one home, one household, one garden, from that approach to saying, no, we need to scale up smallholder production. We need to aggregate smallholders. They need to switch to commodity crops, and we'll set up agro-processing, and then they must get into these commodity value chains. And for us, that's really disappointing because, as I mentioned, we already produce more than enough food in the country. So it's a narrative that's promoted by industry. But the quality of the food is terrible. We're obese, we getting all these diseases.
Diabetic.
And yeah, and even so, if the food's there and you don't have money, you can't access it. And that's what we're seeing. There's high levels of poverty. So we're saying that's not the approach. We should be looking at diverse cropping, local food markets, getting more nutrition into the diet, not these, not just this focus on maize and soya. So yeah, there's a lot of work to be done in addition to trying to update this pesticide legislation that's still from apartheid era. Yeah, so lots of policy, yeah, and the seed laws, etc.
Definitely a lot of work to be done. Thank you very much for drawing that connection and showing very clearly to us the difference between regenerative agriculture and agroecology, and clarifying that social and political elements that form part of agroecology. And you highlighted the sharing of knowledge, which is a big part thereof. So I would like to thank you for sharing your knowledge. And in that way, we can make a difference. I guess we can all go from here and share what we've learned today. And thank you also for sharing your reports. We would definitely go have a look at that. Thank you very much for your time, Vanessa.